On a bright winter road leading to a veteran's cemetery, a snow vehicle suddenly slid across the ice. An elderly widow fell into the snow before former Navy SEAL Grant Sullivan could reach her. But it was Grant's German shepherd, Keen, who stayed pressed beside her until her frightened breathing finally slowed. Then Beatrice looked beyond the cemetery gate and pointed toward a line of red stakes creeping across the memorial field. What began as a roadside rescue became a choice between jobs, memory, and land that belonged to more than one generation. And for Grant, saving that field would mean facing the grief and faith he had avoided since losing his wife. Tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe as we work toward 1,000 subscribers and continue bringing you stories worth remembering. Morning came to High Meadow, Montana, with the deceptive brightness that often followed a night of snow. The roofs shone beneath a pale blue sky. Fence posts wore smooth white caps. Along the lower hills, every pine branch carried enough snow to look carefully sculpted. From a distance, the town appeared untouched, clean, quiet, almost merciful. Grant Sullivan knew better. Fresh snow covered ruts, ice, broken culverts, and every mistake a driver had made the day before. Beauty was often just danger with good lighting. He guided his old pickup along Cemetery Road with both hands steady on the wheel. At 49, Grant still had the broad shoulders and compact strength of the man he had once been in the Navy, but years spent bending over tractor engines had changed the way he carried himself. He leaned slightly forward even while sitting, as though some invisible machine still required his attention. Beneath his forest green canvas jacket, he wore an old olive drab combat shirt. Its camouflage sleeves had faded at the elbows, and the horizontal bands around the upper arms had softened from years of washing. The shirt no longer belonged to his former life. He wore it because it was warm, durable, and did not ask questions. A replacement bearing for the cemetery's aging snowplow rested in a wooden crate behind the seat. Warren Pike, the part-time groundskeeper, had called before sunrise. "Plow sounds like a coffee grinder full of roofing nails," Warren had said. Grant had replied, "That's specific?" "I've had practice." It was the longest conversation Grant had held with anyone all week. Keen sat in the passenger seat, alert but still. The 6-year-old German shepherd had a black saddle over honey gold fur, a dark muzzle, and pale markings above his eyes that made him look permanently skeptical. A small triangular notch marked the edge of his right ear. When the truck turned toward the veteran's cemetery, Keen lifted his head before any sign appeared. He remembered the road. Grant noticed, but said nothing. 3 years earlier, he had driven the same way behind a hearse carrying Elise. Afterward, he had sat beside her grave until the shadows swallowed the headstones and Keen pressed his body against Grant's leg. Grant had not prayed that day. He had tried, but every word had sounded false before it reached his mouth. Since then, he visited only when necessary. He repaired Warren's equipment. He cleared snow after heavy storms. He never walked farther than the maintenance shed. The cemetery itself waited beyond a line of dark pines, white stones rising from white ground like quiet teeth. Grant lowered his eyes to the road. That was when the tracked utility vehicle came around the bend. It appeared too fast from behind the cemetery's side gate, its rubber tracks biting at the frozen road. A black and silver Wintercrest Grounds emblem marked the door. The vehicle fishtailed once, corrected, then struck a patch of hard ice hidden beneath powder. Grant saw 3 things almost at once: a woman in a deep teal coat near the shoulder, a bundle of evergreen branches slipping from her hand, the machine sliding sideways toward her. He hit the brake. The Wintercrest vehicle did not strike the woman head-on. Its rear corner clipped her hip and spun her sideways. She fell hard at the edge of the road, one shoulder disappearing into the snowbank. Grant's truck stopped crooked across the lane. Keen was already on his feet. "Stay." The dog froze, though every muscle remained ready. Grant stepped into air sharp enough to tighten his lungs. The utility vehicle had stopped 30 feet farther down. Its driver stumbled out, a young man in a navy work jacket with reflective bands, rust-colored hair showing beneath his cap. "Oh, God," the man said. "Ma'am?" He ran back, boots slipping. The woman lay on her right side. She was small, perhaps in her 70s, with silver hair coming loose from beneath a pearl-gray knitted hat. Her glasses had landed several feet away. One gloved hand clutched at the snow as if trying to hold the earth still. "Don't move her," Grant said. The driver stopped at once. "I didn't see the ice. I was slowing down. I swear I was slowing down." Grant knelt beside the woman. Her eyes were open, brown and unfocused. "Ma'am, my name is Grant. Can you tell me yours?" Her lips moved before sound came. "Beatrice Lowell." "Do you know where you are?" "At the cemetery." Her voice shook, but her answer came quickly. "Good. Anything hurt besides your shoulder?" "My pride." Grant glanced at her. Even half buried in snow, she had managed to sound offended by the inconvenience. "That'll probably survive." A faint breath of laughter escaped her, then turned into a wince. The driver dropped to his knees several feet away. He was 34 at most, broad-faced and exhausted-looking, with a short copper beard and a circular scar under his chin. "I'm Dale Mercer," he said. "Wintercrest. I tried calling, but there's no signal." Grant checked his own phone. Nothing. "Warren has a radio at the groundskeeper's house." "I can get up to the ridge," Dale said quickly. "There's usually reception near the maintenance marker." He stripped off his reflective jacket and placed it beside Beatrice. "I'll leave the first aid kit. I'll come straight back." Grant studied him for half a second. The man was frightened, not fleeing. "Go. Slow this time." Dale nodded once, shame flashing across his face, and returned to the tracked vehicle. Grant retrieved an emergency blanket from his truck and stretched it between the snowbank and the open passenger door as a crude windbreak. Then he opened the door for Keene. The dog came out low and controlled, circled once, and settled beside Beatrice without touching her injured shoulder. She stared at him. Is he friendly? When he approves of someone. "And do I have time to submit an application?" Grant almost smiled. "Keene," he said. The German shepherd lowered himself fully into the snow. Beatrice placed her left hand into the thick fur at his neck. Her breathing changed a moment later. It became fast and shallow, each breath arriving before the last had finished. Her eyes moved from the road to the cemetery gate, then somewhere far beyond both. "Mrs. Lowell." She did not answer. Keene lifted his head and pressed the broad side of his muzzle against her forearm. The woman's fingers tightened in his fur. For one suspended moment, Grant was no longer kneeling beside a winter road. He was back in a dim bedroom with medicine bottles lined across a dresser. Elise was struggling through another wave of pain, trying not to frighten him. Keene, barely more than a young dog then, had placed his head beneath her hand exactly this way. Grant had stood beside the bed, holding a glass of water he could not make her drink. He remembered the terrible uselessness of loving someone whose suffering would not obey him. "Look at the dog," Grant said quietly. Beatrice's eyes found Keene. "Match him. Slow." Keene breathed steadily, his body warm against the cold ground. Beatrice followed. The panic did not disappear. It loosened, breath by breath, until her grip stopped trembling. Grant looked away first. Beyond the cemetery gate, a broad field stretched eastward beneath untouched snow. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then red survey stakes emerged in a broken line across the white ground. Beatrice saw where he was looking. They moved them again. Grant turned back. Moved what? "The boundary markers." Her voice remained weak, but something sharper had entered it. Wintercrest was hired to maintain the road and grounds, not to redraw the field. Grant adjusted the emergency blanket as wind pushed against it. You need to save your strength. I spent 32 years in the Albright County Records Office. I know the difference between maintenance and acquisition. She nodded toward the stakes. They began near the tree line. Then they came past the drainage ditch. Now they're almost level with the western Memorial Row. Grant followed the line with his eyes. The nearest red stake stood perhaps 40 yards from the headstones. That land belongs to the cemetery? It belongs to the county, but it was donated for memorial and public use. The language matters. Her mouth tightened. Edwin Kroll knows exactly how much it matters. Grant knew the name. Everyone in High Meadow did. Edwin owned Wintercrest grounds and held a major interest in the proposed North Lantern Ridge Resort. The project had been discussed for 2 winters. Jobs, improved roads, new money, all the familiar promises. This is for the county to handle, Grant said. The county has been handling it. The answer carried no anger. That made it worse. Beatrice shifted and winced. Grant checked the road. No ambulance yet. The agreement started as maintenance concessions, she continued. Wintercrest covered work the cemetery could not afford. In exchange, the company received temporary use of land classified as unnecessary for burial. Every new attachment widened that description. You have proof? I have enough to know where the proof should be. That was not the same thing, and Grant suspected she knew it. A faint siren finally rose beyond the pines. Beatrice released Keen's fur only to reach inside her coat with her good hand. She pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope, bent at one corner. If they keep me overnight, take this to Reverend Miriam Holt at the Lutheran Church. Grant did not accept it immediately. I'm delivering a machine part, Mrs. Lowell. That's the size of my involvement. Beatrice regarded him without offense. Her glasses were still lying in the snow, yet somehow her gaze felt exact. I didn't ask you to save the field. The siren grew louder. I asked you to deliver an envelope. Grant took it. The ambulance arrived with Dale close behind in the Wintercrest vehicle. 2 medics stabilized Beatrice's shoulder, wrapped her against the cold, and lifted her onto a stretcher. Before the doors closed, she looked past Grant. Keen. The dog stepped forward. Beatrice touched 2 fingers to the fur between his eyes. You have better judgment than most committees. Then she was gone. For several seconds, the road felt strangely empty. Warren Pike emerged from the small groundskeeper's house, carrying a radio in one hand. He was 67, narrow through the chest and stiff in the knees, with a white mustache that seemed too cheerful for his tired face. I heard enough to know this is bad, he said. Grant handed him the plow bearing. Warren did not look at it. Instead, he stared at the red stakes. I signed some of those work confirmations, he said. Couldn't inspect every acre, not alone. Wintercrest kept the road open when the county wouldn't spend another $1. You think they falsified the work? I think I got old while everybody else got clever. Grant disliked the sentence because it sounded too much like an admission and too much like an excuse. Warren finally took the crate. Beatrice has been warning people for 2 years. And nobody listened? People listen. Then they calculate what listening will cost. Grant looked down at the envelope in his hand. By late afternoon, he had returned home, installed another alternator, fed Keen, and placed Beatrice's envelope beside the unopened boxes in the hallway. He told himself he would deliver it tomorrow. Near dusk, he noticed one of Beatrice's gloves beneath the passenger seat. Grant drove back. The cemetery stood blue and silver beneath the fading sky. He found the second glove near the side gate, half covered in snow. A sprig of fur rested beside it, broken from the bundle Beatrice had carried. Keen moved past him and stopped before the gate. The dog lowered himself onto his haunches, looking toward the red stakes. Perhaps he smelled Beatrice there. Perhaps he remembered Elise. Perhaps a dog required no reason beyond knowing that sorrow had passed through a place. Keen. One ear turned back, but he did not move. Grant called him again. Still the dog remained. Darkness gathered between the headstones. For 3 years, Grant had treated it like a tide that must never be allowed to reach him. He always left before the cemetery lights came on, before the sky deepened, before memory became larger than the road home. This time he walked to Keen's side. He stood with one gloved hand resting on the dog's warm neck while the first cemetery lamp flickered awake. Neither of them crossed the gate. Neither of them left. By the time Beatrice Lowell returned home, the snow along the church lane had been packed into 2 narrow tracks. Her house stood behind the old Lutheran church, close enough that its weathered bell tower could be seen from her kitchen window. The place was small and square, painted a blue that winter had faded almost gray. A narrow porch faced the cemetery road, and someone had already scattered sand across its steps. Grant parked beside a stack of split birch and looked at the grocery sack on the seat beside him. He had brought soup, bread, coffee, canned peaches, and more eggs than one woman with an injured shoulder could reasonably use. He had also loaded enough firewood to last several days. The cream-colored envelope rested on top. He had planned to leave everything on the porch. Keen ruined that plan by standing the moment Beatrice appeared behind the storm door. Her right arm was secured in a dark sling. She wore a navy cardigan over a cream blouse, and her silver hair had been gathered into a low bun that leaned slightly to one side. The bruising near her temple had darkened overnight, but the metal frames of her hexagonal glasses sat straight again. "You found my paperwork," she said when Grant reached the porch. "And your glove. That may be more valuable." Grant held out the envelope. Before Beatrice could take it, Keen pushed his nose through the opening of the door. She looked down at him. "You may enter. Your associate is still under review." Grant carried the wood inside. The house smelled of cinnamon, furniture polish, and the medicinal sharpness of the ointment Beatrice had been given at the clinic. Nothing matched. The kitchen chairs came from different sets. The curtains had been repaired at one corner, and a dark wooden clock ticked above the sink with enough authority to make every silence feel counted. A woman stood at the stove, pouring coffee into a dented red travel mug. Reverend Miriam Holt was 58, broad through the shoulders, with warm brown skin and naturally curled black hair threaded with silver. One sleeve of her plum-colored sweater had been pushed higher than the other, as if she had dressed while answering 3 questions at once. A small pin shaped like a lantern rested near her collar. "So this is the man who believes leaving groceries at the door qualifies as human contact," she said. Grant placed the grocery sack on the counter. "It usually works." "Not in this parish." "I'm not in your parish." Miriam handed him a mug anyway. "That explains the optimism." Beatrice settled at the table, lowering herself carefully so the sling did not catch against the chair. Keen lay beside her without being told. His charcoal harness brushed her skirt, and she rested her good hand lightly on the thick fur behind his ears. Grant noticed she did not clutch him as she had on the road. Today her touch was deliberate, almost formal, as if they had already reached an understanding. Miriam began unpacking the groceries. "You bought 6 cans of peaches." "They keep." "For what? The next administration?" Grant removed his canvas jacket and hung it on the back of a chair. He had stayed because Keen had walked inside. At least, that was the explanation he allowed himself. Beatrice turned the envelope over, but did not open it. "You expected something more dramatic yesterday," she said. "I expected to deliver a machine part. And instead, you got county history." "I've had worse substitutions." A brief smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Then she looked toward the kitchen window, where the top of the church bell tower rose beyond the bare cottonwoods. Walter used to say history was only paperwork that had outlived the people who argued over it. Here, her late husband's photograph stood on a shelf beside the clock. Walter Lowell had been a lean man with large ears and an expression that suggested he had just heard a joke he intended to repeat badly. In one picture, he wore a military field jacket. In another, much older, he sat in a wheelchair beneath the cemetery gate, while Beatrice tucked a blanket around his knees. "He was a medic in Vietnam," she said. "He came home able to sleep through thunder and unable to tolerate a dropped dinner plate." Grant looked at the photographs but said nothing. In his last years, the dementia took people in a strange order. First neighbors, then old friends, then places. Beatrice's fingers moved slowly through Keen's fur. "Sometimes he looked at me as though I had entered the wrong house, but the cemetery bell would ring at noon, and he would turn toward it. Did he know what it was? I don't think so, but he knew it belonged to him somehow." The clock above the sink ticked through the silence that followed. Grant had learned there were moments when people did not need an answer. They needed someone not to rescue them from what they had chosen to say. Beatrice opened the envelope. Inside were no deeds stamped in red, no hidden contract, no document capable of reducing the conflict to a single revelation. There were folded copies, typed lists, handwritten references, and several sheets covered in Beatrice's precise blue ink. She arranged them across the table. "This is what I have," she said. "Not proof. A map to where proof may still exist." The first pages were copies of letters written by families who had donated acreage east of the cemetery decades earlier. The language varied, but the purpose repeated: memorial use, public remembrance, community access. A second document listed old recording numbers and meeting dates. Several entries included notes such as "survey attached" or "refer to county resolution," though the attachments themselves were missing. "These originals should be in the county archive," Grant said. "They are supposed to be." "Meaning?" "The archive building lost part of its roof under the December snow load. Public access is closed until the county engineer clears it. Some files were moved, others were scanned years ago. No one seems entirely sure which are which." Miriam set a plate of toast on the table. "The State Land Office may have duplicate recordings," she said, "and the church has minutes from some of the public meetings." Beatrice nodded toward another stack. "Walter's Veterans Association kept correspondence. Warren may have maintenance records. The surveying company that marked the original boundary was absorbed by another firm in Helena." Grant examined a photocopy of a map. Different lines had been added in different inks over the years. "So no one has the whole file?" "No one person should," Beatrice replied. "That was supposed to be a safeguard. Lately, it has become an excuse." She explained the arrangement slowly. Years earlier, when county funding fell short, the Cemetery Association had entered a maintenance concession with Wintercrest Grounds. Wintercrest advanced money for snow removal, drainage repairs, gravel, and mowing. In return, the company received temporary use of strips of county-owned land classified as unnecessary for burials. The original arrangement had been limited. Then came attachments. One expanded the service area. Another allowed Wintercrest to recover unpaid costs through temporary land use. Later surveys reclassified sections of the eastern field as non-essential because no graves stood there. "Each piece looks administrative," Beatrice said. "That is how these things survive. Nothing appears large enough to frighten anyone." Grant picked up a copy of an invoice. "Wintercrest did the work?" "Some of it." "Probably most of it in the beginning." "Then this isn't theft." Beatrice's gaze sharpened behind her glasses. "I did not call it theft. You called it acquisition. I called it what happens when temporary permissions grow faster than public attention." The distinction mattered. Grant respected her more for making it. Miriam leaned against the counter. Wintercrest Grounds and North Lantern Ridge are separate companies on paper. Edwin Kroll owns the first and holds a controlling interest in the second. So the maintenance company secures use of the land, Grant said, then passes that use to the resort venture. That is what Beatrice believes they are preparing to do, Miriam answered. But belief is not enough for a county hearing. Beatrice tapped one of the maps. The red markers have moved 3 times. I recorded each position, but photographs and notes are not the same as the original restrictions. Grant stared at the papers. He had expected either certainty or foolishness. Instead, he found something harder, an old woman who understood precisely how incomplete her case was. A vehicle door closed outside. Keene raised his head but did not stand. Warren Pike entered, carrying 2 canvas-bound ledgers beneath one arm. Snow clung to his boots and the shoulders of his brown coat. Without his heavy mustache hiding the lower half of his face, Warren might have looked severe. The mustache made him appear apologetic, even when he was not. "I brought what I could find," he said. He set the ledgers on the table and remained standing. These go back 11 years. Work orders, equipment hours, salt, gravel, drainage. Some pages are mine. Some belong to the groundskeeper before me. Beatrice opened the first book with her left hand. Warren watched her struggle for a moment, then gently held the cover flat. "I signed off on jobs I didn't inspect," he said. No one spoke. He looked at Grant rather than Beatrice. The Cemetery Association was down to 2 volunteers who could still shovel. County money got cut again. Wintercrest said they would stop servicing the upper road unless we approved the invoices. "You could have refused," Grant said, and watched veterans' families climb an icy hill on foot. Warren's voice was not defensive. It was tired. "I checked what I could, trusted the rest. Maybe that was laziness, maybe cowardice, maybe just arithmetic." Beatrice turned several pages. Some entries were careful, others showed only dates, equipment codes, and initials. A few charges repeated within the same week. Grant did not point them out. Repetition did not automatically mean fraud. A storm could require the same work twice. A damaged culvert could consume materials in stages. That was the problem. Every suspicious detail had a reasonable explanation when examined alone. Warren lowered himself into the remaining chair. "Edwin kept the road open," he said. "People forget that part because it complicates the story." "Complicated stories are usually the true ones," Miriam said. A gust shook snow from the roof. Miriam moved to the window and looked toward the narrow church driveway. "The transport van will not be running again this winter," she said. "The organization lost its insurance subsidy. 6 widows in my visitation program have not reached the cemetery since November. 3 veterans canceled medical appointments last week because they had no safe ride." Grant glanced toward Walter's photograph. "Edwin offered to pay for a van," Beatrice said. Miriam's mouth tightened. "In exchange for the church endorsing North Lantern Ridge as a community partner." "You refused." "I asked him to separate charity from political support." "And?" "He said that was an admirable distinction made by people who did not have to balance payroll." Grant could almost hear Edwin saying it. The line was efficient, reasonable, and cruel without sounding cruel. Keene shifted closer to Beatrice's chair. She had stopped stroking him. Her hand rested motionless against his neck as she stared at the old ledgers. Walter's picture stood only a few feet away. "He hated asking for help," she said. "When his memory began failing, he apologized every time I helped him with his coat. By the end, I was apologizing to him for things neither of us had done." Her breathing did not quicken as it had on the road. Instead, her voice became too orderly. "I should have filed an objection when the first amended survey appeared. I knew the wording had changed, but Walter had wandered away from the house twice that month, and I was sleeping in a chair beside the front door. Keene rose. He did not press against her or perform any gesture of uncanny understanding. He simply placed his chin on the table near her uninjured hand, occupying the space between the ledgers and Walter's photograph. Beatrice looked at him, then she laughed once, quietly. "You have no respect for document preservation." Keene's tail moved against the floor. The tension in the room changed, not gone, but made bearable. Grant understood then that Beatrice had not brought him into the house because he was a former SEAL. She did not need force, command, or someone willing to make an enemy. She needed a table. More precisely, she needed someone other people might agree to sit beside. Grant pushed his chair back. "I'm not investigating Wintercrest." Beatrice's expression did not change. "I'm not taking this to the county. I'm not giving speeches. And I'm not becoming the face of anything." Miriam lifted her coffee mug. "You seem to have prepared that statement." "I've needed it before." Warren looked down at his hands. Beatrice gathered the papers slowly. "I did not ask you to investigate." "You asked me to bring people together." "Yes?" "That becomes an investigation." "Only if the people bring useful records." Grant exhaled through his nose. Outside, the church bell began to ring noon. The first strike passed through the walls, low and resonant. Beatrice went still. By the third, she had closed her eyes. Grant watched the face of Walter in the photograph, then the woman sitting beneath it, her injured arm held close to her body. He imagined an old man who had forgotten her name but still turned toward that sound. The bell continued. Keene remained with his head near Beatrice's hand. When the final note faded, Grant reached for his jacket. "I'll give Warren a list of what to bring next time," Beatrice said. "There isn't going to be a next time." "Then he can use it for decorative purposes." Grant put on the jacket and opened the door. Keene followed him to the threshold, stopped, and looked back at Beatrice. Grant waited for the familiar resistance, the dog refusing, the moment becoming a symbol too obvious to ignore. But Keene did not disobey. He only stood there, looking from the woman to Grant. The choice remained entirely human. Cold air entered around Grant's boots. He looked toward his truck. The engine would start, his workshop would be quiet. The unopened boxes would still be waiting in the hallway, asking nothing as long as he did not touch them. Behind him, Miriam was stacking cups. Warren had reopened a ledger. Beatrice was trying to align the pages with one hand. Grant closed the door instead of stepping through it. He removed his jacket again and hung it over the chair. "One cup," he said. Miriam poured the coffee. Beatrice did not smile triumphantly. She merely shifted the documents aside to make room for him at the table. Keene returned to her chair and lay down between them. For the next hour, no one saved the cemetery. They only began learning who might know which part of the truth. Wintercrest grounds occupied a long steel building at the southern edge of High Meadow, where the town thinned into equipment yards and frozen pasture. Snowplows stood in two neat rows behind a chain-link fence. Their blades had been raised off the ground, each one carrying a hard ridge of old snow along the top. Men in dark jackets moved between fuel tanks and service bays, while diesel engines idled in the cold. Grant parked beside the office entrance. Keene remained in the truck. 10 minutes, Grant said. The German shepherd looked through the windshield toward the open equipment yard. His right ear, the one with the triangular notch, turned at the sound of a hydraulic lift. Grant had not come to investigate Edwin Kroll. He repeated that thought as he entered the building. He wanted the incident report from Beatrice's accident, written confirmation that Wintercrest would pay her medical expenses, and an explanation of why Dale Mercer had been sent onto an icy cemetery road before a storm. Nothing more. The lobby was warmer than Grant expected. Framed photographs covered one wall, crews clearing mountain roads, excavators repairing washed-out culverts, employees standing beside donated food pallets after a flood. Wintercrest had not invented its reputation from nothing. A receptionist directed him upstairs. Edwin Kroll's office overlooked the entire equipment yard through a broad pane of glass. From behind his desk, he could see nearly every machine entering or leaving the property. Edwin rose when Grant entered. At 56, he was shorter than Grant and built with the compact solidity of a man who had once done physical work himself. His charcoal vest carried a small Wintercrest logo over the chest. Ash-gray hair had been combed neatly to one side, and his clean-shaven face was square enough to make every expression seem deliberate. His pale blue eyes went first to Grant's face, then to the old olive combat shirt visible beneath his open jacket. "Mr. Sullivan." "Grant is fine." "Edwin, then?" They shook hands. Edwin's grip was firm without becoming a challenge. A pale burn scar showed briefly near his left wrist before his cuff fell back into place. He offered Grant coffee. Grant declined. Edwin did not waste time. "Mrs. Lowell's clinic bill has been forwarded to our insurer. Wintercrest will cover the deductible and any treatment the policy disputes. I've already told the clinic not to contact her for payment." Grant placed both hands on the back of the chair rather than sitting. "And Dale?" "Paid leave until the safety review is finished." "You blaming him?" "No." The answer came quickly. Edwin opened a black notebook on his desk. 2 pens lay beside it, perfectly parallel. Dale was below the posted speed. The road had been sanded the evening before. We are still determining whether the surface refroze overnight or whether the drainage channel failed. He was sent out to check survey stakes. Edwin looked up. He was sent to inspect Wintercrest service markers before the storm. "Service markers near the memorial field." "Yes." Grant waited for the denial. It did not come. Edwin closed the notebook. "You didn't come here only for the accident report." "I came because Beatrice Lowell says those markers have been moving." "Beatrice Lowell believes every change to that property is the beginning of a land grab. She worked county records for 32 years. She also retired 14 years ago." Grant finally sat. The office window reflected both men over the machinery below. Edwin leaned back, not defensive, merely prepared. "High Meadow has lost 3 working ranches in 5 years," he said. "The feed store closes after lunch now because there are not enough customers to justify a second shift. Half the cabins west of town belong to people who live here 6 weeks a year. The Cemetery Association cannot cover basic maintenance." "So your resort fixes all of that?" "No, nothing fixes all of that." Edwin's tone remained even. "But North Lantern Ridge would create year-round maintenance work, winter hospitality jobs, contracts for local suppliers, and a reason for the state to improve the South Pass." "The land next to the cemetery was donated for public use?" "Some of it was." Edwin turned a monitor toward Grant. A site plan appeared on the screen, the proposed resort represented in pale lines over an aerial photograph. The main lodge sat well beyond the cemetery. A service road curved toward a ridge. The eastern field lay between them, mostly untouched except for a narrow access corridor. "There are no graves in the section we are discussing," Edwin said. "No structures, no maintained paths. The county has not used it for a public event in 11 years. "That makes it worthless?" "It makes the question more complicated than Beatrice prefers." Grant studied the plan. He disliked how restrained it looked. There were no towers looming over headstones, no sprawling parking lot covering memorial ground. Just a road, utility lines, and a thin section of land that appeared harmless when viewed on a screen. Edwin folded his hands. A town can honor its dead and still make room for the living. Grant looked at him. That line work well at meetings? It works because it is true. Grant thought of the boarded hardware shop on Main Street, of ranch families selling equipment one piece at a time, of mechanics who drove to Bozeman for work because High Meadow could no longer keep them busy. He had seen towns die without flames or disaster. First, the grocery aisle became shorter. Then the school consolidated, the clinic reduced hours, and the last diner began closing on Mondays. Eventually, the only thing left to preserve was the memory of what the place had been. Edwin was not wrong about that. The realization irritated Grant more than a lie would have. "What happens to the temporary land rights Wintercrest has accumulated?" he asked. "They remain with Wintercrest under the current concession." "And if the resort partnership needs them?" "Any transfer would require legal review." That wasn't an answer. It was the accurate answer. The two men regarded each other across the desk. Edwin's phone vibrated. He silenced it without looking. "You think I'm waiting for the cemetery to collapse so I can take the field," he said. "I think temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent when no one can afford to challenge them." For the first time, Edwin's expression hardened. "And I think people who do not carry payroll find purity remarkably inexpensive." The words landed cleanly. Grant rose. Edwin slid a folder across the desk. "The accident report, insurance confirmation, Dale's preliminary statement." Grant took it. At the door, Edwin spoke again. "Ask Warren what the road looked like before Wintercrest took the contract. Ask families whether they prefer an imperfect agreement or an inaccessible cemetery." Grant turned. "You could separate the maintenance contract from the resort?" "I could also close Wintercrest and let the county discover what principals cost in February." Neither man raised his voice. That was what made the conversation difficult. Edwin did not sound like a villain defending greed. He sounded like a man who had spent years turning emergencies into invoices because invoices were the only language institutions answered. Grant left with fewer certainties than he had brought in. Dale Mercer was waiting near Grant's truck. He wore his rust-colored knit cap and an old brown work jacket without the Wintercrest logo. The absence made him look smaller. Keene watched him through the glass. "I heard you were upstairs," Dale said. Grant unlocked the passenger door but did not open it. "You're supposed to be on leave." "I am." Dale rotated a metal ring around his little finger. "My father's got a physical therapy appointment near here. I dropped him off." Grant could tell the explanation had been prepared. "You want to change your statement?" "No." Dale glanced toward the office windows. "I want you to understand what I wrote around." The equipment yard clanged behind them. Somewhere inside the service bay, an air wrench began hammering. Dale kept his voice low. "They told us to inspect the markers before the storm because the development survey team was coming next week. Not cemetery maintenance. Development." "Who told you?" "My route sheet came through Wintercrest Dispatch." "I don't know who approved it above that." "You have the sheet?" "In the system." "Then the county can request it." Dale gave a humorless laugh. "Systems are clean after someone decides they need cleaning." Grant studied him. "Why tell me?" "Because I hit Mrs. Lowell." "The ice did that." "I was driving." Dale looked down at his boots. "My father can't use his left side properly. Wintercrest Insurance pays for half his home care. If I lose this job, he loses more than I do." Grant understood the shape of that fear. Not its exact weight, but the way responsibility could make silence resemble loyalty. "Did Wintercrest bill the cemetery for those surveys?" Grant asked. Dale hesitated. Some route codes were entered under field maintenance. That could mean anything? It could. Dale met his eyes. That's why I didn't call it fraud. Again, no single clean answer. Grant removed a mechanical pencil from his sleeve pocket and pulled the accident report folder from beneath his arm. Write the dispatch date and route code. Dale did. His handwriting was narrow and hurried. Before returning the pencil, he said, "Edwin's not lying about the jobs. My crew needs them. So do I." Truth doesn't require him to be wrong about everything. Dale looked almost relieved by the answer. Grant opened the truck door. Keene leaned forward to smell Dale's hand, but did not seek contact. "That dog always judge people like this?" Dale asked. "He delegates the paperwork." For the first time since the accident, Dale smiled. Grant drove next to the county survey office, which occupied 2 rooms above a pharmacy. Helena Voss had agreed to meet him after Miriam called on Beatrice's behalf. She was standing over a wide map table when he arrived. Helena was 47, tall and lean, with a face sharpened by wind and years spent squinting across open ground. Her dark blonde hair, silvering at the temples, had been cut into an uneven bob and tucked behind one ear. A purple marker rested there like a carpenter's pencil. Her mustard-knit cap and safety glasses lay beside a survey tablet. She did not shake Grant's hand immediately. "You brought documents?" "An accident report and a route code?" "Then you brought questions?" "That too." Helena motioned him toward the table. Several maps of the cemetery field had been layered beneath clear plastic sheets. Colored lines crossed one another, close enough to appear identical at first glance. Helena tapped the oldest line. "This is the dedication boundary recorded after the final land donation." She moved to a second. "This is the operating boundary used by the Cemetery Association 23 years later." Then a third. "This is the Wintercrest Service concession." The lines did not match. The differences were small in some places, wider in others. "Which one is legal?" Grant asked. "That is not a surveying question." "You were hired to check the boundary." "I was hired to compare physical markers with recorded maps. I can tell the county whether the stakes match a document. I cannot tell them which document ultimately controls the land use restriction." Helena studied the route code Dale had written. This corresponds to a pre-development access survey. So Dale was right. It means the crew assignment was connected to access planning. It does not prove Wintercrest billed the cemetery for it. She removed her glasses. "My father is buried in the Western Row. I care what happens there. I also know 6 surveyors who left this county because there was no work. Do not ask me to turn grief into evidence." "I didn't. People usually do without noticing." She placed the plastic sheet back over the maps. "What you have is inconsistency, possibly conflict of interest, possibly administrative negligence, not theft." Grant thought of Beatrice's careful language. She never called it theft. Helena's expression softened by a degree. Then she remembers more about records than most people in that building. Grant left with copies of the map references and a headache growing behind his eyes. At home, the workshop had gone cold. He started the wood stove, fed Keene, then searched the hallway closet for the warranty packet to his backup generator. Weather reports had begun warning of a major storm front approaching High Meadow from the northwest. The packet was not where he remembered leaving it. Grant moved one box, then another. The third box carried Elise's handwriting. Community/church/later. Grant stood with both hands on the lid. He had passed that box nearly every day for 3 years. The word later had protected him. Later was not a date. It made no demands. He opened it. Inside were church newsletters, medical transport brochures, donation receipts, and a folded sheet bearing a hand-drawn title, Meadow Passage. The drawing beneath it was simple enough to be mistaken for idle scribbling. A path curved from a small parking area toward the cemetery gate. Rectangles marked benches. A square near the entrance had been labeled Warm Room. Beside it, Elise had written, Not a Monument, a Way to Get There. Grant sat on the floor. Keene approached, sniffed the papers, then settled nearby without touching them. There were notes from women Elise had met during treatment. One had stopped visiting her husband's grave because she could no longer drive on ice. Another had waited in a cold car while a neighbor placed flowers for her. A caregiver had suggested a seasonal shuttle. Grant remembered Elise trying to tell him about them. He had been sorting medications at the kitchen counter. She had said, "There should be a way for people who can't manage the hill." Grant had answered that the anti-nausea prescription needed refilling. Another evening, she had mentioned a small warming shelter. He had asked whether she had eaten. He had thought practical questions were devotion. Perhaps they had been, but they had also been shelter, his shelter, from every sentence that assumed she might not recover. The discovery did not feel like a message from the dead. It felt worse. It was evidence of a conversation he had refused while she was alive. Grant took the papers to Beatrice before he could put them back. She and Miriam were in the church office, sorting visitation schedules. Beatrice recognized the Meadow Passage heading immediately. "We met 3 times, she said. Elise came to 2 of them. Grant looked down at the rough sketch. "She never told me." Beatrice considered him for a moment. Perhaps she tried. The words were gentle, which kept them from being cruel. Beatrice explained that Meadow Passage had never become an organization. It had been several widows, 2 patients from the oncology clinic, a caregiver, Miriam and Elise, discussing safer access to the cemetery. No funding proposal had been written. No formal plan had survived. Elise did not want festivals or buildings across the field, Beatrice said. She wanted a path, transportation, and somewhere warm enough for a person to catch their breath. Grant placed the sketch beside one of the old boundary maps. All week, people had spoken as though the field had only 2 possible futures: preserve every frozen acre untouched, or turn unused land into revenue. Elise's drawing offered neither answer. It only changed the question. Grant looked through the church window toward the distant white slope where the cemetery road disappeared among the trees. Could the field serve people without becoming the resort? He asked. Beatrice did not rush to respond. That, she said at last, is a question worth bringing to a table. Grant folded Elise's notes carefully along their original creases. For the first time, he did not see the field as land Edwin wanted or ground Beatrice feared losing. He saw a road that did not yet exist, and the people who had been waiting years to travel it. The storm was supposed to miss High Meadow. Every forecast Grant checked that morning showed the same thing. Heavy snow crossing the mountains north of town, then bending east before nightfall. The county issued an advisory, but not a closure. Ranchers moved livestock closer to shelter. Drivers filled their tanks. People looked at the clean blue sky and decided the Weather Service was being cautious. By 3 in the afternoon, the mountains had disappeared. Wind came down from the northwest hard enough to lift loose snow from the fields and throw it sideways across the roads. The light changed from silver to gray, then to the color of old steel. Grant stood outside his workshop, listening to the rising pitch of the wind. Keene paced near the open barn doors. The German shepherd's honey gold coat looked almost pale beneath the darkening sky, while the black saddle along his back gathered the first grains of driven snow. Grant had already filled the generator, checked the oil heater, and moved 2 tractors beneath cover. He told himself it was routine. Inside the house, Elise's Meadow Passage papers rested on the kitchen table where he had left them. He had not decided what to do with them. For the past week, he had carried the question home from Beatrice's house, into his workshop, even into sleep. Could the memorial field serve the living without betraying the dead? The radio in his truck interrupted the thought. County dispatch to any available unit near South Cutoff. Grant reached through the open driver's window and lifted the handset. A tractor-trailer had jackknifed across the main pass. Deputies were diverting traffic along the lower agricultural road that ran near Grant's property. Then a small slide came down behind the redirected vehicles, trapping them between the blocked pass and a wall of packed snow. More than 20 vehicles were stranded. The nearest public shelter was 7 miles away. Grant looked toward the long equipment barn beside his workshop. It had a concrete floor, 2 oil heaters, a backup generator, and enough room for perhaps 60 people if he moved the machinery. He keyed the radio. "This is Sullivan Farm Repair. I've got heated space off Lower Meadow Road." The dispatcher paused. "How many can you hold?" Grant looked at the tractors, tool benches, welding tanks, and stacks of feed pallets. "Ask me again after I move half my life outside." He released the button. Keene stood at the barn entrance watching him. "Don't start," Grant said. The dog's pale eyebrow markings made the silence feel judgmental. Grant climbed into the oldest tractor. Within 20 minutes, the barn no longer resembled a workshop. He drove the tractors beneath the lean-to, chained the welding cylinders upright against the far wall, and pushed 2 workbenches together to form a long table. Keene followed each movement, staying clear of the wheels without being told. The first vehicle arrived behind a county plow. It was a white transport van carrying 8 elderly passengers home from medical appointments in Kalispell. Reverend Miriam Holt stepped out first, her brown-red parka dusted with snow and her brick-colored travel mug hooked through 2 fingers. "Of course this is your barn," she said. "You sound disappointed." "I was hoping for a hotel." Behind her came Nora Bellamy, a 52-year-old home care nurse with close-cropped gray-brown hair and a face that seemed permanently arranged for practical decisions. She wore navy scrubs beneath a winter coat and carried a medical bag in one hand, an oxygen regulator in the other. "I need the warmest corner," Nora said before offering her name. 2 passengers use supplemental oxygen. 1 has poor circulation. Nobody is critical yet. "Back wall, left of the heater," Grant replied. "Generator panel is beside the office door. Bathroom's through there, but the hot water won't last." Nora nodded once, satisfied with the answer. More vehicles followed. A florist's van, 3 pickups, 2 Wintercrest service trucks, a sedan carrying Beatrice and Warren Pike. Several drivers who had been redirected from the pass before the road disappeared behind them. The barn filled with wet boots, engine noise, questions, and the smell of diesel carried in on coats. Grant had spent years entering rooms where order had to be created quickly. The old instincts returned without ceremony. He did not command people. He gave them tasks. Miriam wrote down names, medications, and emergency contacts on a roll of brown packing paper taped to the wall. Nora arranged the vulnerable passengers nearest the heater and checked fingers, breathing, and skin color. Warren carried the cemetery's portable radio to Grant's office, where reception was strongest. Beatrice sat near the supply table with her right arm still in a sling. She sorted pill bottles into labeled groups while correcting anyone who tried to call her fragile. "I survived county budget meetings," she told a worried driver. "This weather lacks imagination." Helena Voss arrived in a county survey truck with snow packed into the seams of her petrol blue jacket. Her mustard cap made her visible even through the open barn doors. "I have terrain maps and a satellite locator," she said. "The slide is shallow, but the wind is loading the north bank. Nobody should walk back toward the pass." Edwin Kroll came in behind her, carrying a red fuel can with Dale Mercer at his side. Edwin's ash-gray hair had lost its usual order beneath a black cap. His expensive gloves were gone, replaced by heavy work gloves darkened with grease. "We've got diesel and heating fuel in the service trucks," he said. "How much?" Grant asked. "Enough to keep this barn warm through morning, or enough to keep all 4 Wintercrest vehicles operational. Not both." Grant looked toward the passengers huddled near the heaters. "Keep 2 trucks ready. We use the rest." Edwin's jaw tightened. "If the county needs the plows, they'll need living operators." For a moment Grant expected an argument. Edwin glanced at Nora kneeling beside an elderly man, then at the snow blowing through the barn entrance. "2 trucks stay fueled," he said. "Dale, bring in the reserve drums." No one applauded. Dale simply turned and went back into the storm. The barn doors became the next problem. Each gust drove powder through the lower gaps, coating the concrete and forcing the heaters to work harder. Grant and Dale cut 2 sheets of plywood, while Edwin held the portable light. "You always run emergency shelters without permits?" Edwin asked. Grant measured the gap. "Only on weekdays." Dale snorted despite himself. They bolted the plywood across the worst opening and hung heavy canvas above it. By the time they finished, all 3 men had snow inside their collars. The arrangement remained imperfect, but the wind no longer entered, like an animal trying to force its way indoors. As evening fell, the storm erased the windows. The generator hummed. Miriam passed out coffee and soup heated on a camping stove. Someone found a deck of cards in the transport van. Warren relayed updates from County Dispatch. The truck still blocked the main pass. The slide could not be cleared safely until the wind dropped, and no one was leaving before morning. Keene moved among the stranded adults without excitement. He allowed gloved hands to touch his back, but he chose where to stay. Near the heater sat Russell Dane, a 71-year-old veteran with a narrow face and an old tremor in both hands. He had been quiet since arriving. When a metal pallet fell outside with a loud crash, Russell stiffened, lost track of the room, and began breathing too quickly. Keene crossed the barn and lay beside his chair. He did not paw at him or press for attention. He simply rested against Russell's boot. The older man looked down. "What unit were you with?" he asked the dog. Keene blinked. Russell's mouth twitched. "Classified. Figures." His hands were still shaking, but his breathing slowed. Grant watched from the generator panel. The moment was not dramatic enough for anyone else to notice. That was why it mattered. Nora approached him a few minutes later. "One of the oxygen tanks in the van is nearly empty. The spare is in a blue medical case in the rear compartment." "I'll get it." "You'll need a line." Grant tied a rope around his waist and secured the other end to a steel support post. Keene stood as soon as Grant pulled on his coat. "You stay." The dog did not move toward the door, but his eyes remained fixed on Grant. Grant reconsidered. Keene knew the path between the barn and parking area. More importantly, he could find the barn by scent if visibility collapsed completely. "Fine. Close." Outside, the world ended 5 feet from the door. The rope ran through Grant's glove as he moved forward. Snow struck the hood of his jacket with a dry hiss. Keene stayed against his left leg, low to the ground. The transport van was no more than 40 yards away, yet Grant nearly walked past it. Keene veered toward the tire tracks buried under fresh powder and stopped at the rear bumper. Grant opened the doors, found the blue case, and clipped its strap across his body. On the return, a gust spun him half around. For several seconds he saw no barn, no rope line, only white, moving in every direction. Keene pushed against his knee, then pulled toward the right. Grant followed. A faint rectangle of amber light emerged through the snow. When they entered the barn, Nora took the oxygen case without ceremony. "Good," she said. "Now stop dripping on my patients." Grant removed his hood. "That's the gratitude I was hoping for." It prevents swelling of the ego. Across the barn, Edwin had been watching. He handed Grant a towel. "You took the dog. He knows the property. And you trust him. With weather. Edwin looked toward Keene, who had already returned to Russell's chair. People are harder? People write contracts. Edwin almost smiled, but the expression never fully formed. Later that night, the storm settled into a steady roar around the metal walls. The emergency had entered its waiting phase, the dangerous lull when there was nothing left to repair and too much time to think. People began talking, not as a formal meeting. No one stood at the front. The conversation simply moved from one cluster of chairs to another. Mavis Calder, a 69-year-old widow from the transport van, said she had not visited her husband's grave in 2 winters. "I can walk," she explained. "I just can't walk on that hill when it freezes. There's a difference, though people enjoy pretending there isn't." Russell said the open memorial field was the only place in town where he could sit without anyone asking whether he was all right. "I'm usually not," he added, "but that isn't always an emergency." A Wintercrest driver named Tom Reese spoke from beside the supply table. "If the resort dies, I'm back to seasonal work. My mortgage doesn't become seasonal just because people dislike the project." No one answered quickly. Beatrice looked toward him. "That matters." Tom seemed surprised. "So does the field," she added. "The difficulty is that both things matter at the same time." Grant stood near his office door, listening. The discussion could have turned into accusation. Instead, the storm had made everyone temporarily dependent on the same heaters, fuel drums, and coffee pot. People could disagree, but none of them could pretend they lived in separate versions of High Meadow. Grant went into the office and returned with Elise's Meadow Passage papers. He taped the rough sketch to the plywood wall between the packing paper roster and a rack of socket wrenches. The drawing looked almost childish in the industrial barn, a curved path, a few benches, a square marked warm room. Beneath it, Elise's handwriting remained small and firm. Not a monument, a way to get there. Grant did not explain who had drawn it. He only asked, "If the field belongs to the community, what does the community need it to do?" At first, everyone talked at once. Miriam raised her dented mug. "One voice at a time, unless someone wants me to begin assigning pews." The room quieted. Mavis said the view toward the graves should remain open. Russell agreed. He did not want a lodge visible beyond the headstones. Nora said any winter route needed a level drop-off area, handrails, and somewhere heated where a person could wait without risking exposure. Warren said all of it would fail without permanent maintenance funding. Tom Reese asked where that money would come from. "Not bake sales," Beatrice said. "We would all die before the first invoice was paid." A few people laughed. The laughter mattered. It did not solve anything, but it loosened the belief that every proposal had to emerge already perfect. Helena took the purple marker from behind her ear and drew 3 headings on the brown paper. Memorial Corps. Winter Access, Sustainable Funding. "These are needs," she said, "not a plan." Edwin stood at the edge of the group with his arms folded. "They are real needs," he admitted. "They also do not cover the cemetery's debt, maintain the road, or replace the jobs the resort was designed to create." Grant faced him. "No. But now we're discussing what the town needs before we discuss how much land your project wants." Edwin's pale eyes moved to Elise's sketch. "And if the needs cannot pay for themselves, then we keep working." "That is not financing." "No," Grant said. "It's the part that comes before financing, the part where people decide what they refuse to lose." Silence followed, but it was not hostile. Outside, the wind struck the barn hard enough to make the roof groan. Inside, Warren adjusted the radio. Nora checked the oxygen flow. Dale carried another fuel container toward the heater. Miriam added names beneath Helena's 3 headings. Edwin studied the rough sketch without dismissing it. No agreement was reached that night. No boundary changed. No contract disappeared. No one discovered a brilliant compromise hidden inside the storm. But by morning, the dispute no longer belonged only to Beatrice, Edwin, or a handful of county files. It belonged to the people who had spent the night breathing the same heated air, sharing the same fuel, and admitting that survival required more than winning. The barn had sheltered them from the weather. Without anyone intending it, it had also given High Meadow a room large enough to hear itself. The storm left High Meadow buried, but not silent. For 3 days, plows worked from before dawn until after dark. Snowbanks rose above parked cars. The county reopened the main pass 1 lane at a time, while residents traded photographs of Grant Sullivan's barn as if it had become a landmark overnight. Someone called it the High Meadow Emergency Center. Grant crossed the words out on the cardboard sign and replaced them with Sullivan Farm Repair. "Please stop renaming my building," Miriam added beneath it. "Community meeting, Thursday, 6 p.m. Grant stared at her handwriting. "You carry markers for this exact purpose?" "I carry markers because committees fear blank surfaces." He refused the title of chairman. He refused spokesperson, coordinator, and, most firmly, hero. But he agreed to let people meet in the barn because it was the one place where Wintercrest employees, cemetery volunteers, county residents, and opponents of North Lantern Ridge had already shared soup without throwing it at one another. By Thursday evening, the machinery had been pushed to the walls again. A folding table held maps, ledgers, invoices, letters, and 3 trays of food no one admitted bringing. Keene lay beneath Grant's workbench, his black and gold body positioned where he could see both doors. The group developed its own order without Grant imposing one. Beatrice sat at the end of the table with her sling removed, but her right arm still held close. She organized old correspondence by family name and recording date. Warren supplied maintenance ledgers, equipment logs, and boxes of invoices from the Cemetery Association. Helena covered one wall with layered survey maps. Miriam brought statements from older residents who could no longer reach the cemetery safely. Nora prepared a short report on winter transport, accessibility, oxygen storage, handrails, and the minimum temperature required in any waiting shelter. Dale arrived after dark with photocopies folded beneath his coat. He did not wear his Wintercrest jacket. "These are dispatch schedules," he said. "No private customer information. Just crew assignments, route codes, and equipment hours." "Did you have permission to copy them?" Grant asked. Dale's fingers found the metal ring on his little finger. "I had permission to access them for my job." "That wasn't my question." "No." The room went still. Grant looked at the pages, but did not take them. "Can the county obtain these through a lawful records request or subpoena?" "They should be able to request the billing attachments from Wintercrest." "Then you tell us what to ask for. You keep those copies." Dale appeared disappointed and relieved at the same time. Beatrice nodded once. Improperly obtained evidence gives people an excellent excuse to ignore properly raised questions. The meeting resumed. Calvin Rusk arrived 15 minutes late, carrying a battered leather briefcase and apologizing to no one. At 63, Calvin had the broad, careful movements of a man who had once been heavier. His silver hair was clipped close, and an old National Guard pin sat on the lapel of his brown wool coat. Half-moon reading glasses rested low on his nose. He looked less like a courtroom lawyer than a tired professor who had misplaced patients somewhere around 1998. "I was told there would be records," he said. Miriam pointed to the tables. Calvin surveyed the piles. "I was misled. This is archaeology." He had retired from legal practice 2 years earlier after decades of municipal and land use work. Beatrice had known him from county meetings, though not always fondly. Calvin removed his coat, sat beside the oldest maintenance agreement, and read in silence for nearly 20 minutes. No one interrupted him. At last, he placed one finger on a paragraph. There it is. Grant leaned closer. The agreement allowed Wintercrest temporary use of land deemed not necessary for active cemetery operations. That phrase appears throughout the amendments, Beatrice said. I know. Calvin took off his glasses. I helped write the original language. The admission changed the air in the barn. Warren stopped turning pages. Dale looked toward the floor. Even Helena lowered her marker. Calvin did not soften the statement. 24 years ago, the county needed a temporary place to stage gravel, equipment, and snow storage. The eastern field had no graves. We wrote the clause broadly because we expected administrators to use judgment. And they did, Helena said, repeatedly. Yes? Calvin's mouth tightened. We treated ambiguity as flexibility. That works until someone discovers flexibility can be monetized. You couldn't have predicted North Lantern Ridge, Grant said. No, but I could have written a boundary. I could have required independent valuation. I could have defined temporary. Calvin opened his briefcase and removed a yellow legal pad. Regret is not a remedy. Let us identify one. Over the following weeks, the barn became less a meeting place than a machine built from human attention. Requests went to the Montana Land Records Office, the county clerk, an old surveying company in Helena, and the State Historical Archive. The county's damaged records building remained closed, but scanned indexes revealed where duplicates might exist. Letters arrived from descendants of the original donors. Some remembered nothing. Others had preserved copies in family boxes. No document solved the matter. Together, however, they began to form a pattern. Wintercrest had performed substantial legitimate work. It had plowed roads during years when the county paid late. It had repaired drainage after spring floods and replaced gravel washed from the upper drive. But several invoices repeated equipment hours within overlapping periods. Some charges listed eastern field maintenance on days when Dale's dispatch codes showed crews supporting a development access survey. Later amendments expanded land use areas without independent appraisal. One survey line followed a drainage boundary that did not match the original dedication map. None of it resembled a villain's confession. It resembled what happened when too many small decisions escaped scrutiny. That made it harder to explain and more difficult to dismiss. Edwin responded before the group released any findings. Advertisements appeared in the weekly paper. North Lantern Ridge mailed glossy brochures to residents showing winter jobs, improved road access, and a projected increase in county revenue. A radio interview featured workers who feared losing steady employment. The campaign did not attack Beatrice by name. It did something more effective. It asked High Meadow whether memory could pay wages. Attendance at the barn meetings doubled. So did the arguments. A mechanic said he would support almost any project that kept his daughter and son-in-law from moving away. A widow accused resort supporters of selling sacred ground. Tom Reese, the Wintercrest driver who had spoken during the storm, asked whether those defending the field planned to pay his mortgage. Grant stopped one meeting before voices became shouts. No one here gets to turn another person's need into a moral failure. The room quieted. He pointed toward the maintenance invoices. Wanting a job doesn't make someone greedy. Wanting access to a grave doesn't make someone opposed to progress. We keep forgetting that because anger is faster than thought. Beatrice was staring at one of the earliest amended surveys. Her face had lost its usual firmness. I saw this, she said. Calvin turned toward her. When? The year it was filed. She removed her glasses and folded them carefully. The operating boundary changed, but the dedication restriction was not attached to the packet. I told the deputy clerk the file was incomplete. I mentioned it to a commissioner in the hallway. "Did you submit a written objection?" Calvin asked. "No." The single word carried farther than any speech. Beatrice looked toward Walter's photograph, which Miriam had brought from her house at Beatrice's request and placed near the document boxes. He had begun wandering by then. Twice that month, neighbors found him on the road. I was sleeping in a chair against the front door because he had learned how to open the deadbolt. No one rushed to absolve her. Beatrice would not have accepted it. I kept telling myself I would return to the file when Walter stabilized, she continued. He never did. I retired the following year. The next clerk inherited a record that looked complete because I had not made my concern part of it. Her voice remained controlled, but her left hand shook against the table. Keene rose from beneath the workbench. He crossed the barn, stopped beside Beatrice, and leaned the weight of one shoulder against her knee. He did not look at the papers. Beatrice placed her hand on his neck. "I knew better," she said. Grant stood across from her. "Yes." Miriam glanced at him, perhaps expecting comfort. Grant did not take the word back. "You knew something was wrong," he said. "You also had a husband who could not safely be left alone. Both things are true." Beatrice looked up. The silence still mattered. It did. Grant's thumb moved unconsciously against the ring beneath his shirt. "So does what you say now." The words were not forgiveness. Grant had begun to distrust forgiveness offered too quickly. They were something narrower and perhaps more useful, permission to act without pretending the past had caused no harm. The group needed more than records and testimony. Helena insisted on that. "We know what we oppose," she said during the next meeting. "That is not the same as knowing what can function." She invited Elias Monroe from a rural development nonprofit based in Helena. Elias arrived in a compact car coated with road salt and spent his first 10 minutes apologizing for tracking snow onto Grant's concrete floor. He was 45, with a narrow build, deep brown skin, and closely shaved hair. His glasses had round frames, and he wore a navy field coat with a measuring tape clipped where most men kept a pocket knife. He did not begin by asking what the community wanted to preserve. He asked what it could afford. That irritated nearly everyone, which Helena seemed to take as proof she had invited the right person. Elias measured the proposed access corridor, reviewed traffic flow, estimated construction costs, and examined Edwin's economic projections. He spoke with Wintercrest employees, older residents, county staff, and the Cemetery Association. His conclusion pleased no faction completely. A resort of the proposed scale will place commercial traffic within the memorial viewshed and require infrastructure across disputed land, he said. The numbers also rely on occupancy rates that are optimistic for this region. Tom Reese folded his arms. So no development. I did not say that. Elias spread a new site plan across Grant's workbench. A smaller winter service center could operate at the outer edge. Equipment storage, road maintenance, limited visitor services. It would preserve jobs, though fewer than the resort proposal. He pointed to another section. The Memorial Corps can be protected through a permanent public use easement. A level drop-off, heated waiting room, and accessible path can fit without entering burial areas. And the shuttle? Miriam asked. Lease revenue could support part of it. County and veterans grants would need to cover the rest. A fundraiser may buy a vehicle. It will not insure, fuel, staff, and maintain one for 10 years. Beatrice gave Grant a brief look that said she appreciated anyone willing to insult bake sales with numbers. The plan evolved slowly, not from Elise's sketch alone, but from Nora's safety requirements, Helena's boundaries, Calvin's legal restrictions, Warren's maintenance costs, Dale's operational knowledge, Miriam's access records, and Elias's financial limits. The emerging proposal protected the memorial core and the view across the headstones. It created a winter path, a heated shelter, and a safe shuttle drop-off. It allowed a limited commercial lease at the far edge. Wintercrest could bid for transparent maintenance contracts and shift some workers toward building and servicing the new infrastructure. It was smaller than Edwin's vision, more expensive than Beatrice had hoped, less pure than either side wanted. Grant trusted it for precisely those reasons. The night before the county hearing, he could not sleep. He drove to the cemetery before sunrise. Keene rode beside him, quiet in the dark cab. The eastern sky had only begun to pale when Grant stopped near Elise's grave. He did not remain at the maintenance gate this time. He walked between the rows. Miriam was already there, clearing light snow from the stone of an elderly parishioner whose family lived out of state. She wore her brown-red parka over her clerical collar and held a small brush in one gloved hand. "You pastors keep strange office hours," Grant said. "So do widowers." Keene wandered a few steps toward Elise's stone, then sat. Grant looked at the name carved there. He had avoided saying certain things because once spoken, they would become real in a way grief had not yet permitted. "I don't think I stopped believing," he said. Miriam rested the brush against her boot. "I think I stopped believing prayer was meant for people like me." "What kind of people are those?" "The kind who asked once and did not get the answer." A line of gold appeared above the mountains. Grant kept his eyes on the stone. After Elise died, praying felt like standing outside a locked door and pretending someone had invited me in. Miriam did not tell him the door was open. She did not offer a verse or explain suffering. She looked across the field where red stakes punctured the snow. "Perhaps prayer is not opening the door," she said. Grant waited. Perhaps for now it is only refusing to walk away from it. The wind moved softly through the pines. Grant did not bow his head. He did not find language large enough for faith or small enough for pain. He remained beside the stone. Keene settled at his feet. Miriam resumed brushing snow from the neighboring grave. The sun rose slowly over High Meadow, revealing the field not as sacred ground or commercial acreage alone, but as a place burdened by everything the living still had to decide. Grant stayed until the light reached Elise's name. The Albright County Agricultural Exhibition Hall had been built for livestock auctions, seed demonstrations, and winter equipment shows. It had never been intended to hold an argument about memory. By 8 in the morning, every folding chair was occupied. Residents stood along the walls beneath banners advertising feed suppliers and tractor parts. Wintercrest employees gathered near the eastern aisle in dark work jackets. Veterans, widows, ranchers, county staff, and business owners filled the rest of the room. At the front, a temporary council table had been assembled on the old auction platform. Microphone cables ran across the floor beneath strips of silver tape. Grant chose a seat near the rear. He wore a dark flannel shirt beneath his canvas jacket, not the olive combat shirt people had begun associating with the storm shelter. Keene lay at his boots in a charcoal harness, watching the room through amber-brown eyes. Grant had been offered a place beside the working group. He declined. This was not his case alone, and he did not want the room arranged as though it were. At 9, Commissioner Marla Hensley called the emergency hearing to order. Marla was 61, with iron-gray hair cut close around a composed face and a posture that seemed designed for difficult rooms. A small silver brooch rested on the lapel of her navy jacket. Her voice was measured, but the hand holding her pen remained too still. She had supported the early Wintercrest concessions. Everyone knew it. Some believed that made her compromised. Others believed it made her the only commissioner willing to admit how the county had reached this point. "This hearing will address the temporary status of land use rights adjacent to the High Meadow Veterans Cemetery," she said. "It will not determine criminal liability because none has been established. It will not determine final ownership because the county already holds legal title. It will determine whether current concessions should remain active while their approval and use are independently reviewed. The distinctions disappointed anyone hoping for spectacle. Grant felt relieved. Helena Voss testified first. She projected 4 maps onto a white screen. Colored lines showed the original dedication boundary, the cemetery's operating area, the Wintercrest service concession, and the proposed access route for North Lantern Ridge. The physical stakes currently in the eastern field align most closely with the latest service use map, Helena explained. That map differs from earlier survey references and intersects land described in the original dedication as serving public memorial purposes. An attorney representing Wintercrest stood. Does that prove my client moved markers unlawfully? No. Does it prove the proposed resort road would cross burial plots? No. Does it prove fraud? No. The attorney paused, apparently satisfied. Helena looked toward the commissioners. It proves the county has allowed several different definitions of the same field to exist without resolving which one governs public use. The satisfaction disappeared. Calvin Rusk followed. He explained the original maintenance agreement and the phrase he had helped write 24 years earlier. Land not necessary for active cemetery operations. We intended equipment staging and snow storage, he said. We failed to define duration, acreage, valuation, or the relationship between cemetery operations and the broader memorial dedication. Are the amendments invalid? Marla asked. Some may be voidable because of incomplete approval procedures. Others may be enforceable. That is why an independent audit and legal review are necessary. Calvin did not perform regret for the crowd. He simply placed responsibility where it belonged, including on himself. Dale Mercer approached the microphone next. He had worn his Wintercrest jacket. The choice mattered. He was not pretending to stand outside the company whose practices he was questioning. His voice shook during the first few sentences. He confirmed that crews had been dispatched to inspect routes connected to the proposed development. Some assignments carried field maintenance codes also used for cemetery work. Were you instructed to falsify invoices? The Wintercrest attorney asked. No. Were you told to conceal development work? No. Then what exactly are you alleging? Dale looked toward the rows of co-workers. I'm saying the codes were broad enough that a person reviewing an invoice later might not know which project the crew was actually supporting. You are speculating? Yes, Dale said. That is why somebody should check. A murmur moved through the room. The answer was not dramatic. It was more dangerous than drama because it was difficult to dismiss as revenge. Warren Pike testified that he had signed completed work confirmations without inspecting every location. Why? One commissioner asked. Because the cemetery had one functioning plow, 2 volunteers over 65, and no money left by February. You understood your signature carried legal weight? Yes. And you signed anyway? Warren's white mustache shifted as he pressed his lips together. Yes. He did not ask for sympathy. Beatrice Lowell entered the witness area carrying her worn leather document case. Her shoulder had healed enough that she no longer wore the sling, though she moved her right arm carefully. She spoke about the incomplete survey packet she had noticed years earlier. I warned people in conversation, she said. I did not enter the concern into the official record. Why not? Marla asked. My husband had dementia. He had begun leaving the house without knowing where he was. Beatrice adjusted her hexagonal glasses. That explains my decision. It does not erase its consequences. The room became still. Neglect rarely begins with one grand act, she continued. Usually, several tired people each decide a problem can wait. One postpones a letter. One signs a form without checking. One assumes the next office will notice. Eventually, the absence of a decision becomes the decision. Grant felt the words move through the hall. They did not accuse only Edwin. That was why people listened. Edwin Kroll presented after lunch. He stood without notes at first. His charcoal suit fit him perfectly, but fatigue had loosened the discipline in his face. The ash-gray hair above his forehead no longer lay entirely flat. He did not deny that Wintercrest and North Lantern Ridge shared his leadership. He presented payroll figures, 32 permanent employees, 14 seasonal workers, insurance obligations, equipment loans, outstanding county invoices for legitimate snow removal, drainage repairs, gravel, and emergency work. If every concession is suspended indefinitely and the county refuses to recognize valid costs, Edwin said, Wintercrest will violate lending covenants within months. North Lantern Ridge will lose its investors. More than 30 households will lose stable income. A man in the audience called, "That isn't the cemetery's fault." Edwin turned toward the voice. "No, it is not." He faced the commissioners again. "But a remedy that protects public land by destroying the company that maintained it is not automatically justice." Grant watched several Wintercrest employees lower their eyes. Edwin's case was not merely financial theater. The company had debts, workers, and obligations. The county had relied on it for years, then recoiled when the cost of that reliance became visible. The hearing recessed before Grant spoke. Outside, people filled the snow-packed lot in tense clusters. Reporters approached Beatrice. She declined them. Wintercrest employees smoked beside the equipment fence. Miriam moved among both groups with her dented travel mug, speaking little. Grant stood beside his truck. Keene remained close to his left leg. Edwin approached alone. "You understand what happens if they freeze everything," he said. "Yes." "Do they?" "Some do." Edwin looked toward the hall. "Your proposal keeps a service center. It does not replace the resort." "No." "It does not create the revenue this county was promised." "No." "Yet you're about to tell them it is the moral solution." Grant met his eyes. "I'm going to tell them it is a workable beginning." Edwin gave a short laugh. "That is a pleasant phrase for smaller. Sometimes smaller is what remains after the numbers stop pretending nobody lives nearby." Edwin's expression hardened. Before he could answer, Keene stepped between them, not defensively, not growling, merely changing position as people moved through the narrow space. Edwin looked down at the dog. Keene looked back without judgment Grant could identify. The moment ended when Marla called everyone inside. Grant spoke last. He carried no medals, photographs, or military records. Elise's original sketch remained at home. He brought only the plan the group had developed and a single page listing the 3 needs identified in the barn. He began with the Memorial Corps, then winter access, then sustainable funding. He described the proposed public use easement, the heated shelter, the shuttle drop-off, and a limited commercial lease at the outer edge. He explained that Wintercrest could compete for transparent maintenance contracts and operate a smaller equipment center. "This proposal does not preserve every acre exactly as it has always been," Grant said. "It also does not treat unused ground as empty ground." He looked toward the audience rather than Edwin. "We are not asking High Meadow to freeze itself in the past. We are asking development to recognize that some places carry value greater than their sale price." A commissioner asked whether the plan guaranteed jobs. "No." "Does it fully fund transportation?" "No." "Does it settle the county's debt to Wintercrest?" "No." Grant allowed the answers to stand. "It gives us a structure in which those problems can be negotiated without surrendering the memorial field first." The commissioners withdrew for nearly 2 hours. When they returned, Marla read the temporary order. All further land transfers and development preparations were suspended for 60 days. No survey stake could be moved. The Memorial Corps was placed under temporary construction protection. An independent audit would examine invoices, approvals, and legitimate county debt. A negotiation group would include Wintercrest, county officials, the Cemetery Association, and community representatives. No one cheered. The order gave neither side enough to celebrate. Edwin left through a side door. The 60 days that followed were harder than the hearing. Wintercrest's investors threatened to withdraw. County lawyers warned that canceling every concession might trigger expensive litigation. The audit confirmed duplicated billing and improperly categorized survey work, but it also found substantial unpaid maintenance costs owed to Wintercrest. Marla publicly acknowledged that the county had failed to require independent valuations. Her admission did not erase criticism, but it changed the negotiations. The county could no longer treat Edwin as the only party responsible. Edwin rejected the first two proposals. Beatrice rejected a third because the commercial corridor interrupted the view across the memorial field. Elias revised projected revenue. Helena shifted the outer boundary. Nora reduced the shelter footprint without compromising access. Calvin drafted an easement that protected public memorial use while allowing limited activity beyond it. Dale attended as an employee representative. He argued that reducing the project should not mean discarding workers who had followed company orders in good faith. Grant attended every session but chaired none. There were days when the plan nearly collapsed over drainage costs, road width, or liability insurance, small, stubborn matters that did not care how morally important the field had become. On the 57th day, Edwin arrived with his black notebook closed. "If I accept the reduced lease," he said, "the resort partnership ends." No one contradicted him. "I will have to sell 2 machines and the mountain parcel. Some investors will sue." Marla folded her hands. "The alternative is years of litigation over the concessions and an immediate suspension of development." Edwin looked around the table. "Everyone here gets to call this compromise because I am the one losing the largest thing." Beatrice answered quietly. "You are losing the largest plan. That is not the same as losing the most." Edwin looked toward her. For a moment, Grant thought he would leave. Instead, Edwin opened the notebook. "What is the minimum lease term that allows financing for the service center?" The final vote took place 2 weeks later in the county courthouse. The agreement passed 4-1. The Memorial Corps received a permanent public use easement. North Lantern Ridge was canceled at resort scale. Wintercrest received a limited outer edge lease for a winter equipment and service center. The county recognized verified maintenance debt and established a repayment schedule. Future contracts required public bidding, independent valuation, annual audits, and disclosure of related business interests. Part of the lease revenue would support licensed transportation for older residents. Edwin relinquished every claim within the protected memorial area. Some residents applauded, others remained seated. Tom Reese, the Wintercrest driver, calculated silently whether the reduced operation would keep his position. Mavis Calder cried when she heard the winter access path had been approved. Warren closed his eyes. Beatrice held Miriam's hand for only a second, then released it. Grant felt no victory. The resort was gone. Some projected jobs would never exist. Wintercrest would survive, but smaller. The county would spend years paying debts it should have confronted earlier. Outside the courthouse, evening light rested blue across the snow. Edwin waited beside the steps. "You destroyed the plan I spent 9 years building," he said. Grant stopped several feet away. Keene stood beside him. "No," Grant replied. "You built a plan without leaving enough room for the people who had to live beside it." "I was trying to keep this town alive." "I believe you." The answer seemed to anger Edwin more than denial would have. Grant continued. But keeping something alive is not the same as owning the right to decide what it becomes. Edwin looked across the street toward the Wintercrest trucks. Then down at Keene. The dog stood calmly between the two men, tail low, ears attentive. Edwin extended one hand. He stopped before touching the harness. Keene did not move closer. After a moment, Edwin lowered his hand. A signed agreement could define land, debt, access, and responsibility. It could not command trust to return. Edwin walked toward his truck. Grant remained on the courthouse steps with Keene as the lights came on across High Meadow. No one had received everything. For the first time, that felt less like failure than proof the decision belonged to more than one man. A year later, the eastern field no longer looked abandoned. It still looked like Montana. Snow rolled across it in long, clean folds. Wind moved through the grass hidden beneath the white surface, leaving shallow ripples that changed whenever the light shifted. The mountains remained distant and severe, indifferent to contracts, meetings, and the names people gave the land below them. What had changed was the road. A gently graded path now ran from the lower parking area toward the High Meadow Veterans Cemetery. Its surface had been textured to resist ice, with a low handrail following the steeper section. Small amber lamps stood at measured intervals along the edge, modest enough not to compete with the open sky. The red survey stakes were gone. A wooden sign near the entrance carried the new name, High Meadow Memorial Passage. Beneath it, in smaller lettering, for remembrance, access, and public service. The county still owned the land. The Cemetery Association managed the graves. A new nonprofit, the High Meadow Memorial Passage Association, handled fundraising, volunteer schedules, and the practical work of making sure good intentions did not quietly become neglected obligations. Calvin Rusk had refused the position of president. "I have already written enough language people may regret later," he said. He accepted a seat on the advisory board instead. Marla Hensley pushed through annual audits, public bidding requirements, and conflict of interest disclosures for every future service agreement connected to the field. Helena Voss returned each autumn to verify the boundary markers with survey equipment rather than trust that lines would remain where people remembered placing them. No one called those measures inspiring. That was one reason they endured. The warming shelter stood near the cemetery gate. Its walls had been built from salvaged timber taken from an old county equipment shed, sanded but not disguised. Inside were two long benches, a first aid cabinet, coffee, emergency blankets, and a board listing transport times. Nora Bellamy had inspected the medical supplies so thoroughly that even Grant had begun feeling sorry for the bandages. "You realize gauze cannot experience fear," he told her. "Then it has no excuse for being improperly stored." The transport service was operated by a licensed elder care organization from the neighboring county. Lease revenue from Wintercrest's reduced service center covered part of the cost. The county, a Veterans Foundation, and the annual Winter Festival covered the rest. No one pretended the finances were permanent. Each year would require reports, grants, maintenance, and people willing to do work that would never appear in a ceremony photograph. Grant trusted the project more because of that. Anything worthwhile required upkeep. The first winter fundraiser began on a clear Saturday beneath a sky so pale it seemed made from ice. There were no carnival rides or loudspeakers shouting over the cemetery. Folding tables stood near the warming shelter with coffee, soup, bread, and donation forms. Veterans, widows, caregivers, medical workers, ranchers, Wintercrest employees, and adult relatives of those buried there moved along the lighted path. The event felt less like a festival than a town choosing to stay awake together. Grant arrived before sunrise with Keene in the passenger seat and a toolbox behind them. His old barn had become an officially designated emergency support point during severe storms. A county radio had been installed in the office. Fuel, blankets, water, and medical supplies now occupied a locked cabinet beside the generator. The sign Miriam had once written on his cardboard still hung above the workbench. Community meeting, Thursday, 6 p.m. Grant had never removed it. Keene jumped down from the truck wearing his charcoal harness with its muted amber trim. At 7, the German shepherd still moved with the smooth, deliberate stride of a younger dog, though a little silver had appeared beneath his dark muzzle. His right ear retained its triangular notch. The faint scar above his right eye caught the morning light when he turned his head. He studied the completed path, then looked at Grant. "I know," Grant said. "They managed without your supervision." Keene sneezed into the snow. Near the lower entrance, Dale Mercer was reviewing a safety checklist with 2 Wintercrest operators. His rust-colored cap had been replaced by a hard hat while equipment was moving, and a bright vest identified him as Field Safety Supervisor. The position had come with slightly better pay and a great deal more paperwork. Dale claimed the paperwork was Edwin's revenge. Wintercrest had survived. The company was smaller now. It had sold 2 major machines and the mountain parcel once intended for the resort lodge. Yet most permanent employees kept their positions through transparent snow removal contracts, construction of the access path, maintenance of the warming shelter, and operation of the new winter service center at the outer edge of the property. The center was visible from the county road, but not from the graves. Helena had insisted upon that line of sight. Edwin Kroll arrived before most volunteers. He wore an older Wintercrest vest over a gray and black flannel shirt. Without the planned resort, the embroidered logo on his chest represented less than it once had. Perhaps it also represented something more honest. He did not join the opening remarks. Instead, he walked the path with Dale, checked drainage grates, and stopped beside one of the lamps leaning slightly toward the snowbank. "The frost lifted the footing," Dale said. "We installed it. The subcontractor installed it. Our contract, our lamp." Edwin knelt with a wrench. Grant watched from a distance. Edwin had not transformed into a beloved community figure. Some residents still distrusted him. Others still blamed Grant's group for the jobs that the canceled resort might have created. Edwin attended every audit meeting and complained about half of them. He also submitted every invoice with complete equipment codes. Redemption, Grant had learned, was rarely a speech. More often, it was an irritating sequence of correct decisions made after the applause had ended. The shuttle arrived at 9. Its side door opened onto the level drop-off area. Beatrice Lowell descended first, wearing her deep teal coat, burgundy scarf, and silver fir branch brooch. Her shoulder had healed, though winter had slowed her steps. Keene immediately crossed the path toward her. He did not pull Grant or rush. He simply shortened his stride when he reached her and walked beside her at the pace she chose. Beatrice placed one gloved hand lightly on his harness. "Finally," she said. "A gentleman who understands scheduling." Grant joined them. "You're 40 minutes early." At my age, early is simply another word for successful. Behind her came Mavis Calder and several older veterans and widows. The shuttle driver lowered the handrail. Nora waited at the shelter entrance while Miriam carried a tray of coffee with the dangerous confidence of someone who did not believe in lids. Warren Pike stood near the cemetery gate in a clean brown coat. For 20 years he had begun winter events by walking the grounds alone, checking every path and grave marker himself. That morning, Helena had already inspected the boundary. Wintercrest had cleared the road. Volunteers had checked the shelter. Dale had completed the safety review. Warren still looked for problems. He simply no longer had to carry all of them. "You missed a patch of ice," he told Grant. "Where?" Warren pointed toward an area already covered with sand. Grant stared at him. "Habit," Warren admitted. The opening ceremony was deliberately brief. Marla spoke about public responsibility rather than victory. Calvin read the legal description of the protected easement, earning a groan from Miriam and polite laughter from everyone else. Beatrice opened the small memorial archive inside the shelter. The collection held copies of land donation letters, service records, photographs, oral histories, and accounts from the families who had cared for the cemetery over several generations. Nothing was hidden behind a locked mystery. The documents were indexed, copied, and available for review. Beatrice had insisted on that. "Memory becomes dangerous when only one person knows where it is kept," she said. Grant stood outside during most of the remarks. He had never become president of the association or chairman of the board. His role was less visible. He repaired the shelter heater, maintained the emergency generator, opened his barn for meetings, and made coffee strong enough to be described in insurance reports. People consulted him anyway. This still surprised him. 3 years earlier, he had believed withdrawal was a private act. He understood now that absence also altered a community. Every capable person who stepped away left a space someone else had to carry. That did not mean Grant had become sociable. Some mornings he still worked for hours without speaking. Some nights he passed Elise's closed sewing room and felt the old resistance rise in him. Her death had not become beautiful because something useful grew around it. Loss remained loss, but it no longer occupied every room by itself. Near noon, Miriam found Grant standing beside the shelter with a worn notebook beneath his arm. "Elise's?" she asked. He nodded. He had discovered it in the same box as the Meadow Passage papers. Most pages contained ordinary things: grocery lists, appointment times, reminders to call people, notes about garden soil, questions for doctors. The final pages were not final words. Elise had not known which entry would be her last. That mattered to Grant. Death had not arranged her life into a message. She had simply lived until she could not. One line had been written near a list of names from the oncology clinic. Faith is not believing we will never lose one another. It is believing love still has work to do after loss. Grant had read the sentence many times. Until that morning, he had never brought it to the cemetery. Miriam looked toward Elise's row. "You want company?" "No." She nodded without offense. "I'll keep the coffee from becoming a legal substance." Grant walked alone with Keene. The new path carried them easily over ground that had once been uneven and glazed with ice. The amber lights were not yet visible beneath the bright sky, but their dark posts followed him between the snowbanks. At Elise's grave, Grant brushed a thin layer of snow from her name. Keene settled nearby, not against him, not performing comfort. The dog simply occupied the same silence. Grant opened the notebook. He read the sentence once. The field behind him was not quiet. A shuttle door closed. Someone laughed near the warming shelter. A wrench struck metal where Edwin and Dale worked on the tilted lamp. Miriam called for more coffee cups. Warren objected to something no one else could see. For years, Grant had believed grief required stillness. Now, love seemed to be making an unreasonable amount of noise. He looked at Elise's name. "I'm not asking to forget you," he said. The words sounded small in the winter air. That was all right. "I don't want to." He paused. Prayer had once felt like a locked door. Standing there, Grant understood that he had been waiting for the door to open in the wrong direction, as though faith should return what had been taken or explain why it was gone. Nothing opened. No sign appeared. The mountains offered no answer. Grant closed his eyes. "Just help me use what remains well." His voice nearly failed on the last word. He did not know whether the prayer reached heaven. He knew only that it had finally left him. Keene raised his head and looked toward the lower road. The shuttle had returned with another group of older residents. Beatrice stood beside the driver, directing people toward the shelter with the authority of someone who had appointed herself before anyone could object. Grant laughed under his breath. When he returned to the path, the afternoon had begun to soften. Low sunlight gave the snow a warm gold edge. Beatrice entered the archive with Keen walking beside her. Nora checked the first aid cabinet again, finding no new sins. Helena recorded the position of the permanent boundary marker. Calvin argued with Marla about a footnote in the association's bylaws. Edwin and Dale finished resetting the lamp. Edwin stood and tested it, even though daylight made the result difficult to see. The bulb glowed faintly. He glanced toward Grant. Neither man waved. They did not need to pretend trust had been completed. Across the field, people used the place. That was enough for the day. The fundraiser ended before dusk. Folding tables were packed away. The shuttle made its final departure. Warren locked the archive, then handed Beatrice a duplicate key after she reminded him it was her job. One by one, vehicles left the parking area. The amber lamps came on automatically as the sky deepened. Keen remained near the gate, looking across the field. There were no red stakes now, no temporary markers moving quietly toward the graves. Only the low lights following the winter path from the parking area to the cemetery and back again. Grant stood beside the dog and rested one hand on his shoulder. "All right," he said. "We'll stay a little longer." Keen lowered himself into the snow. Grant remained standing. Together, they watched the lights hold their places against the coming dark. They were not guarding the dead from being forgotten. They were making certain the living would always have a way to return. Sometimes healing does not mean leaving grief behind. It means allowing love to keep doing its work through us. Grant could not bring Elise back, but he could help keep a road open for others carrying losses of their own. And perhaps faith often returns that way, not as a sudden answer, but as the quiet strength to stay, serve, and light one small path through the winter. What part of Grant and Keen's journey stayed with you most? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and hope. May God give you peace for what you cannot change and strength to use your love well.